Hi, everybody. I'm Charlotte Davis. I am a registered dietitian and have been involved with First Place for Health for many years. Ever since 1995, I've been leading groups. This program has changed my life, and I plan to forever be in First Place for Health as long as I possibly can, and love to share with the members in First Place for Health groups and make new friends through the program. One of the things that attracted me to First Place for Health was the fact that it was based on science and that it was not based on any fads. And I couldn't prove that it was. So that's what got me interested in it. So I've tried to carry that out throughout any presentations that I do, that we stick with science and what's out there that we can really have evidence of. And today we're going to be talking about plant-based eating. It's a real hot topic right now. You see it on social media, on the news, in just everywhere. Recipes in magazines, recipes in blogs, whatever. And plant-based eating has taken on a life of its own almost. But as with every type of fad like that, there's some good, and then there's some things that may not be. And I love to just have the opportunity to share with you the science behind plant-based eating, some advantages and things, and then also some challenges. We're going to be talking about that as we go today. If you're a note taker like me, there is a listening guide that's attached to the presentation with Summit, and a lot of this is already on there, so you won't have to write it down. Just there's a few blanks you can fill in as you go. So I hope you'll take advantage of that. So let's go. First, I wanted to just visit with you personally a little bit and show you a picture of my family. This was taken back in early June. We were on a cruise to Alaska. So this was one of our fancy night pictures that we took. And my husband, Tony, we've been married 36 years. And my daughter, Kayla, and my son, Jake. And then there's another picture right after that taken in front of Mendenhall Glacier in Alaska. And oh my goodness, God has given us so much beautiful creation all over this world that place is gorgeous. So if you ever have a chance to go, I would highly recommend that. Okay, so before we start talking about plant-based diets and how to follow one, we're going to talk about what one actually is. So there's a lot of discussion about the definition of a plant-based diet. Between nutrition professionals and consumers, everybody is kind of confused a little bit about what it means. But for the purposes of today, we're going to talk about it from the vegan standpoint. And so the strictest definition of a plant-based diet is vegan, which is elimination of all animal products, including meat, poultry, fish, eggs, dairy, and sometimes honey, depending on how the person interprets that. So there are other things like plant forward, plant focused eating, flexitarian. We're going to come back around to some of those things, but for the purpose of the majority of this, we're going to talk about vegans so that you can see how to eat totally plant-based. Okay, so the first question I get a lot of times is, are plant-based diets healthy? And my answer is they can be, because almost with any healthy eating plan or any eating plan, there's a good way to do it and there's a not so good way to do it. So research shows that a plant-based diet that has significant health benefits is one that is done correctly. So if you're properly following a plant-based diet, you're going to be having whole foods and limiting the use of oils, and you're going to be watching for added sugars. You're going to be avoiding processed foods and things like that, which leaves mainly only really good for you foods like God made them. And anytime we can eat foods like that, we know they're going to be healthy. Also, it usually eliminates things that tend to make you have issues like there's not a lot of saturated fat in plant-based diets usually, for instance. So that helps with your heart and things like that. We'll be talking more about the advantages here shortly. Okay, so to start off, let's talk about some of the research-based advantages of plant-based eating. First of all, heart disease. It helps reduce your risk of heart disease, which is the #1 killer in the world. So that's always a positive when any sort of eating plan can do that. I wanted to mention a study about that. A 2012 study involved 124,706 participants. And any of you guys who know me and have heard me before, you know that I only like to look at studies that have a lot of people over a long period of time, not just 10 people for 2 weeks. So this is a good one. So it examined cardiovascular mortality and overall cancer incidence among vegetarians and vegans. Researchers concluded that compared with omnivores, which eat meat and vegetables, vegetarians had a 29% lower ischemic heart disease mortality and an 18% lower incidence of cancer. So that's a pretty big thing when it comes, when you can decrease your risk of heart disease and cancer. The second thing on there is diabetes, type 2 diabetes, especially. A study in 2009, which is a while back, but still very based on newer studies, they are also validating this. They found that both vegan and lacto-ovo vegetarian diets, which lacto-ovo means they include dairy and eggs, they were associated with approximately 1/3 of the risk of developing type 2. I'm sorry, 1/2 of the risk of developing type 2 diabetes compared with non-vegetarians. And then pescatarians, which also eat meat, and semi-vegetarians, which we'll talk about later, another word is flexitarian, they were associated with a 1/3 to 1/4 risk of developing type 2, reduction in the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So that's pretty significant. Type 2 diabetes is growing in our country, unfortunately. The other thing on this list, hypertension or high blood pressure, is the reduced risk for that. And most people believe that is associated with eating less sodium from processed food because you're eating more whole foods, more fruits and vegetables. So there's not a lot of sodium, which is known to affect blood pressure in a lot of people. And the types of cancer that are generally a reduced risk with eating plant-based that we have research for are colon and breast. So those two, if those two run in your family, then plant-based eating may be a good way for you to help offset some of that risk. And then the last one is obesity, reduced risk of obesity, because when you fill your plate up with more fruits and vegetables, you're less likely to get as many calories as you would otherwise. So reduced risk of obesity. Some other advantages of plant-based eating are improvement in your cholesterol level, and it's especially your LDL or bad cholesterol that is affected by that. So you can lower that number, and your total cholesterol is also affected by that. So you can lower that with plant-based eating. Better glucose control for diabetics. If you're already a diabetic and you probably have this test every once in a while that they give you that's called hemoglobin A1C. And they check for long-term blood sugar control with that. And that is better for people who follow plant-based eating. So that's pretty good. And then management of dementia, and some studies are even showing the potential for warding off Alzheimer's, for keeping dementia where it is and keeping it from progressing into Alzheimer's. So that's awesome as well. Weight management, which kind of ties back to the reduced risk of obesity later. So if you're at a good weight, eating plant-based is a good way to maintain that weight and keep it in a good range. And then the last one on that list is C-reactive protein levels. And that is something that's associated with inflammation. So if you have like rheumatoid arthritis or the tendency toward any type of chronic inflammation in your body, plant-based eating is positive in helping that to get that immunity up and that inflammation down. And that's because of all those wonderful phytochemicals that God puts in all these fruits and vegetables that we don't even know what they're doing. But they're saying it's associated with that. Okay, so all these wonderful things that plant-based eating can do. There are some challenges though. Despite all the health benefits because of the challenges, only about 3.3% of American adults are vegetarian or vegan, and half of those are vegan, about 46%, a little less than half, according to a 2016 survey. Of course, this is 2023. Any new polls may show it going up, and probably will, but 3.3% back in 2016. So not a huge percentage of Americans doing that. So I wonder why that is. Let's look at the first thing there. Saying goodbye to animal proteins is not easy for most people. If you've grown up eating meat with every meal, if you associate meat with so many different celebrations or just anything, I mean, it's hard sometimes to give up animal products without really focusing. And then meeting all the recommended nutrition guidelines is tough because once you start leaving out some of the animal-based foods, it is a little harder to get some different nutrients, and we're going to be talking about those in just a minute. And then as a result of that, meal planning can be a little bit more time consuming. So if you're going to plan to go toward plant-based eating, you're going to have to spend a little bit more time purchasing, planning, looking for recipes, helping it work in the plan. So it does take a little bit there. Okay. So what are the nutrients that we need to look out the most for when we're trying to eat plant-based? What do we need to really make sure that we get that we don't normally have to worry about as much? So the first thing is protein. Um, if a vegan eats a balanced diet with protein-rich foods at each meal, things like beans and peas, soy foods, nuts, seeds, and nut butters, whole grains, they can meet their protein needs. You can do it. You just have to include those things at each meal. And if they have higher needs, like say they're an athlete or it's a pregnant mom or a breastfeeding mom, sometimes you really have to work hard to get enough protein for growth and for breastfeeding. So talk with a dietitian, talk with someone, if you're in that situation, an athlete or pregnant or breastfeeding, try to make sure that you're getting enough. If you just eat protein at every meal for the average person based from these groups we just talked about, you'll probably be fine. But those are some special needs situations. The next one is calcium. As you know, most people say, if you say, okay, what's calcium in? Your first answer is usually milk, right? Or dairy. And that's the case. Most of us are used to getting our calcium from dairy. But there is calcium in lots of vegetables as well. And the vegetables that are the highest that you can actually use the calcium from is the cruciferous category of vegetables. And that would be things like broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage. Those have quite a bit of calcium, and it's also in a form that you can break it down pretty easily. So those are some things you definitely would want to include. It's also in fortified soy milk or any type of fortified milk that's not dairy based. A lot of times they will add the calcium in there as a supplement to help it. So just kind of watch that and try to include those cruciferous vegetables in there as well. The next thing is vitamin D, which kind of goes along with calcium. We need vitamin D to absorb calcium. So if you're using a milk substitute like a soy milk or a oat milk or a nut milk, then just make sure that it's got both calcium and vitamin D in it, added to it, so that they can work together and keep your bones strong during that time. Also, fortified cereals are good. They will often add vitamin D to those. Actually, there is no normal, natural vitamin D in a handful of things. That's where it is, such as egg yolks, fatty fish, fortified milk, beef liver, and also we can get it from sunlight. But if you don't get a lot of sunlight, then your body doesn't manufacture a lot of it either. So that's the place where you just need to make sure that you're getting the vitamin D and the calcium together in some things that you're consuming. The next nutrient of interest when you're following a plant-based diet is zinc. You may have heard about it during the pandemic a lot. I know a lot of people, even I took some when I had COVID, even though I had all the vaccinations and everything, I got COVID, but they told me to take zinc because it boosted immunity, so during that time I did. But a lot of vegetarians and vegans especially vegans, are low in zinc status compared with non-vegetarians. And so zinc plant food sources include soy products, beans and peas, grains, seeds, and nuts. There's just not a lot in them. So you have to make sure that you get enough quantity. And at-risk individuals, which would be like an older adult, a pregnant or a breastfeeding mom, you might need to take a supplement to make sure that you get enough during that time. Iron is the next nutrient of interest. I know when I was growing up, everybody always, I was anemic when I was a teenager. And they would say, eat liver, which I liked liver, but most people don't like liver, but the meat sources of iron, and it's in all meat. There's just more of it in liver. But if you don't get meat, which is got iron in it called heme iron, that heme iron is really easily absorbed by your body. But for some reason, the iron that's in plants, like in beans and peas and raisins and things like that, dark greens, it's not as easily absorbed. It's called non-heme iron. And so, what you might want to do would be to consume a vitamin C source along with your iron source, because vitamin C sources, which would be things like oranges and melons and berries, which are all plants, all those can help you absorb the non-heme iron in the vegetables, sources of iron. So, that's a helpful way to do that. Vitamin B12 is the next one. This vitamin is only found in animal foods. So some vegetarians turn to fermented foods because it has the bacteria present in there, which will have some vitamin B12 in it, or nutritional yeast, or seaweed, or algae that has those same bacteria that'll have the vitamin B12, but there's really just not quite enough in those. So you'll need to be sure that you look for things like vitamin B12 fortified foods like fortified yeast, cereals, soy products, or even supplements, because vitamin B12 is a thing that's kind of really tough to get if you're eating completely plant-based. And also, if you are, just as a note, if you're going to try to do more of the seaweed and the algae type based things, those don't work real well with people on blood thinners. So you might want to avoid those if you're on blood thinners and go with a supplement or something like that instead. Just depends on you, what's going on with you. So talk to your doctor about that. And then the last nutrient of interest is iodine. Plant-based diets can be low in iodine if the person doesn't use iodized salt. Most of us do use iodized salt. So if you do, there's probably not going to be a problem as long as you don't, none of us are supposed to eat tons of salt. But if you use iodized salt, you're probably getting enough iodine. Or if you're using seaweed or algae, both of those are going to have more iodine from the seawater. So that's going to also have some of that in there. Okay, so we've talked about all the nutrients we want to try to focus on while we're eating plant-based. And now we're going to talk about how plant-based does not necessarily equal perfect. Okay, sometimes there are unhealthy ways to eat plant-based. And in the first place for health food plan, we have a category in each food group that's called the caution foods. And those foods are caution foods whether you're on plant-based or whether you're not. So some of those things would be like French fries, potato chips, pastries, all those things listed on the slide there, soft drinks, desserts. All of those things can be completely plant-based, but that doesn't mean that they're healthy for you to eat. So highly processed foods, even if they originate from plant sources, may not have the same health benefits as whole or minimally processed plant foods. So like if you get a potato chip, which has been highly processed, that's not nearly as healthy for you as a baked potato or sweet potato would be because it's been processed out. Okay. There is a great quote I got from Tufts University's health letter by the editor, and that he talks a little bit about that. He says the more processing a food undergoes, the less it retains the structure of its original plant or animal source. And then he says loss of intact food structure speeds up digestion and causes an undesirable rush of nutrients into the bloodstream. It also leaves little food to reach the large intestine, starving the friendly gut bacteria that live there. So it can affect your microbiome in your gut if you eat a lot of processed foods, because there's nothing left by the time it gets to your large intestine, because there's no fiber, there's no anything, because you've eaten something highly processed. So it's important that we remember that too. Then there's ultra processed foods in both plant and animal origin are linked to risk of chronic disease. There's a lot of studies that show we're higher at risk for diabetes, we're higher risk for heart disease, we're higher risk for certain cancers if we eat a lot of processed foods. So whether that food is a processed edamame that's been, pulverized and turned into something, it's still processed. So you need to be careful and look at the ingredients and make sure you can pronounce them all, first of all, and eat things that have few ingredients, less additives. Okay, this next slide I'm going to include just kind of for fun, okay? We are told by our we're marketed to all the time, no matter where we are, whether we're at a gas station or in the line at the grocery store. And my daughter and I were coming back from a Comic-Con and stopped at a gas station. And so I saw this sign, and it says, "You can't buy happiness, but you can buy donuts." And that's the same kind of the same thing. So I threw this in there. First of all, those are highly processed, possibly all plant-based foods, but there is nothing in that that is going to meet your happiness needs. I mean, it's God gives us true joy and happiness. And if we're looking for that in a donut or in any other kind of food to fill that void, not going to happen. We need to realize we need to put our love into something else. So, anyway, just thought that was pretty funny. Just saw it sad, but funny. Okay, so if you want to start eating plant based, if you're thinking, hey, these benefits sound so great, I don't know where to start. That sounds a little bit overwhelming to think about all of that stuff. Well, as with anything else, small steps is the way you start. If you try to turn on a dime and do it completely perfect the first day, it's probably not going to stick, and you're going to not be happy with it. And it needs to be something you can live with. We talk about that a lot in First Place for Health, the Live It plan. We want you to be able to live with it. So, how do you get to plant-based eating that you can live with? First of all, cut out one animal product at a time. Let's just say you're a big beef eater or maybe a sausage eater. And so let's start with that one and just say, okay, I think I can do without that particular protein source. That, I'm going to try to eat more chicken, more fish. Start there, and cut that out. Then gradually add, gradually take away, I should say, those the meat sources, animal sources, and then add in the non-animal sources of protein. The next thing I think is very critical. Find a non-dairy milk alternative that you like. You may have heard me say several times throughout this that we're looking to those milk alternatives to provide your calcium, your vitamin D. The things that the milk would normally provide from a dairy source. You're gonna need to find a non-dairy source for that you like. I have lots of friends who love almond milk. My son loves this one latte at this place he goes that has oat milk in it. There's all kinds of non-dairy milk sources. So just try to find one that you like. You may not like the taste of all of them. Then stock up on beans, nuts, seeds, and vegan meat alternatives. And when you're doing the vegan meat alternatives, watch out for the processing. Make sure it's not something that's so processed that you're going to lose the benefit, because research that has been done on plant-based diets hasn't really included yet all those vegan meat alternative things that, like burgers that look like burgers, but they're made out of something else. You have to kind of realize that some of them they're not created equal. Some of them are going to have a lot of whole food ingredients. Some of them are going to have a whole lot of additives. So there's not been a lot of research done with those yet. So try to focus on the whole foods and the beans, nuts, seeds, and things like that as much as possible. And then eat from all the food groups daily. And you can do that with a vegan diet or any type of vegetarian diet. And the next slide is a sample First Place for Health-based, plant-based food plan for a day, a meal plan for a day. So you can see there at breakfast, you've got a half a cup of oats, you've got some chopped nuts, some berries, and then a cup of that soy milk or other milk alternative. Or you can do like soy yogurt or yogurt alternative as well. If you prefer to eat your dairy or non-dairy, then you drink it. So you can do that. For lunch, we've got a veggie burrito there with a whole bunch of vegetables and a whole grain tortilla and some chips and salsa. And then we've got for dinner a tofu stir fry with a whole lot of different vegetables in it, and sauteed in some olive oil. And then some suggestions for snacks would be like the dairy-free cheese or in whole grain crackers, or apple slices with nut butter. So that plan right there would fit into the 13 to 1400 calorie First Place for Health food plan. So you would just be making the non-animal source choices out of the different groups. And a question I get a lot, if you're focusing more on eating vegetables and plants, sometimes people say, well, I'm going over the amount of vegetables on my food plan. I'm getting 4 cups of vegetables instead of 2. And that's okay. Okay. It used to, in the early days of First Place for Health, there were some vegetables that were considered free foods. I mean, you just, they were on the free list and you just ate them. And that's because they have very few calories. So a lot of your non-starchy vegetables are going to have very few calories. They're going to have a lot of water content. So if you eat those extra vegetables from those non-starchy vegetables, especially, that's going to be fine. You're not going to really blow your calories unless you are really going over on fat or something somewhere else. So just stay with those non-starchy as much as possible, and don't worry about it if you go a little bit over. Also, remember that if you're eating beans as your protein source, you don't have to count them as a vegetable. A quarter cup of beans counts as a meat too. So you don't have to count that toward your vegetable. So that's just a couple of first place notes there. Okay, so is Charlotte telling me today that I need to go totally plant-based to be healthy? No, Charlotte is not. You do not need all plant-based to be as healthy. It is a healthy way to eat, but there are also many other healthy ways to eat. So, some other healthy diet plans based on research, which we always base everything we talk about in first place on research, are the lacto-ovo vegetarian, which is what we talked about earlier. It includes lacto means milk, ovo means egg. So milk and eggs, so dairy and eggs can be included, and lots of research showing that that is a good thing. In fact, a 2016 study found that a combination of plant and dairy foods could help close nutrient gaps that were found oftentimes in vegetarian diets. So, and especially in the United States. And then there was another study that was done where they added extra milk into the plant-based plant-based diet that also showed that the people had better magnesium, iron, folate, and they had better calcium, protein, and vitamin A and D levels. So there's something to be said for lacto-ovo vegetarian. Pescatarian, which we mentioned earlier, adds fish. That makes it easier to get the protein, and it also gives you some omega-3 fatty acids, which are highly, good for your heart. So that's good. And then flexitarian. I'm going to talk about this a little bit because this is really getting to be a hot topic. And some people call this a semi-vegetarian. But this is someone who wants to be more vegetarian and plant-based, but doesn't want to be super strict and totally give up meat. And it's easier to follow as a result of that. And research is behind this too. It shows that flexitarians weigh 15% less. They have a lower rate of heart disease, just like the totally plant-based eaters. They have a lower rate of diabetes and cancer, just like the totally plant-based eaters. And they live 3.6 years longer than people who eat meat all the time. And flexitarian is a good way to put it is they're pro-plant, but not anti-animal. They like to have some. And then WFPB, which stands for Whole Food Plant-Based. And it's kind of similar. It's where you're following a whole foods eating plan, but you're including some animal products based on your preferences and trying to stay with the leaner ones usually, to try to keep it like if you're eating chicken breast or you're eating fish, you're staying with whole foods, but you're including some animal products in there as well. The next diet I'd like to talk about that is a very healthy diet is the Mediterranean diet. Over the last 10 years, there's been tons of studies done about this, literally hundreds. It was quoted in one of the sources I looked at. But there have been found benefits to the traditional Mediterranean diet, which is rich in whole grains, fruits, vegetables, beans, herbs, spices, nuts, and olive oil, which all sounds familiar to what we've been talking about already. But it also includes 2 servings a week of seafood, moderate portions of dairy foods and eggs, and occasional poultry, with infrequent servings of red meat and sweets. And this diet has so many things associated with it that have been linked to, greater health. So here's the list as of right now. Longevity, improved brain function, reduced risk of several chronic diseases, which is heart disease, cancer, those things we've already talked about, healthful weight, lower risk of depression, and improvement of rheumatoid arthritis. And then in a 2017 study that included over 7,000 people, it showed that people following the Mediterranean diet and consuming the most yogurt They were adding yogurt to theirs as their dairy. They had fewer cardiovascular risk factors than those without the increased yogurt. And then another study in 2018 showed that combining the Mediterranean diet with higher levels of dairy was associated with lower blood pressure, better HDL levels, and triglycerides. Whereas the plant based plan kind of covered getting your LDL improved and your overall cholesterol improved. The Mediterranean ends up helping your HDL. So every kind of cholesterol and your triglycerides are assisted by this. So this might be an option for you, as far as, if you don't want to go totally plant-based, but you want to do something that you know is healthy as well, any of these options would be good. And then, of course, last but not least, the first place for health food plan with the superfoods, because it's basically the Mediterranean diet if you do that. If you choose all the superfoods and you eat in the quantities that are recommended for first place for health, then you can lose weight and have all these heart healthy and cancer prevention benefits, just like with a purely plant-based diet. So just wanted to mention that. I have one more quote by the guy, the editor of the Tufts Health Letter. He says, "We cannot assume a product is healthy simply because it's plant-based. At the same time, research has found that a number of animal-based foods, for example, fish, other seafood, yogurt, poultry, and cheese, are not associated with negative health benefits." So we hear negative things about a lot of animal products, but those things I just mentioned, there's not any negative press about those, I guess you could say. The research shows that those things are okay. So anyway, that's kind of wrapping up, what I wanted to talk about plant-based diets. If you're moving in that direction, I hope that this gave you some good tips and some common sense. That's one of the things I always try to do, is make it practical. Because if we can't understand it and figure out a way to do it, then we're not going to stay with anything. So we want to make sure that we get some practical tips. If you have any questions based on this presentation, feel free to put your questions in the chat during Summit, and I will get to those. I will be, I'm actually with my mom at the hospital during Summit, so I will check those periodically, but also you can email me at the email that's listed on the handout or on this last slide, and I will be glad to try to help you. So happy healthy day and enjoy the rest of Summit. Bye.